Hey there, it's Christian from 7 Gaming Network, and I'm here with another Tactica. This time it's for a red villain character, or the command villains, and it's the First Order Stormtrooper. Now, I think it's fair to say that this Tactica is probably going to be fairly short, because this guy is pretty much as straightforward as they come in the game currently. But there are still a few interesting little interactions that we can have a look at. So I'm going to go through the card, the die sides that we see. We'll go through his ability. Spoiler, he hasn't got one. And his role, what decks you can put him in. So still quite a bit to go through, but it won't take us too long. He is super one-dimensional. Let's take a look at these sides on his die. We're looking at 3 ranged sides. Now we've got a 1, a 2 and a 2 for 1 resource. Now that 2 for 1 resource, it is a little bit painful. It's awkward to see that. However, we're in red, so it's not super terrible, but it's a little awkward. But let's talk about it. We've got 3 damage sides. So we're looking at 50% chance of rolling damage each time you roll this character. And bear in mind as well that for his points value, he is the cheapest. He's the cheapest character in the game. So I feel like with a 50% chance of rolling some damage, that actually makes him a little more consistent in terms of damage output than some other characters that we might think about about having damage output, such as, I don't know, Han Solo for instance. He's got more damage sides than he has, and actually than a lot of characters in the game. He is a very pure, let's go for the damage with this character. It's not masses, but a 1, a 2 and a 2, I wouldn't have been surprised if they made it a 1, a 1 and a 2. So that 2 side, we really like the straight up 2 side. So this character really is, he's bringing you some damage, or he's bringing you a resource, or there's nothing, because of course he also has these 2 blanks. So he's a very, very straightforward die, and the reason why you're including this character in your deck, his role is to dish out damage. I mean, that's the only reason he's there. There is a secondary aspect to him, which is that because he's so cheap, if you've got some way of using an ability like Guardian in your team, so maybe you're running a Phasma who is giving these First Order Stormtroopers the Guardian ability, then what they can do, of course, is they can have this sort of meat shielding effect, where they're effectively diving and throwing themselves in front of laser blasts and lightsabers left, right and centre, because they're the ones who are taking the damage to try and stop it going on to your important characters, whatever it is, central to your strategy. So whilst the die is very clearly about dishing out damage, and whilst I would say probably the majority of decks that are going to include him are going to lean towards, well, let's get some damage out of him, a very important aspect to him is that he is going to be able to be expendable, and it's not the end of the world if you lose his 1 die, and for 7 health for the 7 points cost, it's pretty good. It's fine, we're happy with that, very happy with that. So his role really is to do damage or to take some damage and soak it up a little bit. Now there are a whole bunch of decks out there that are using this little chap, and that's really because of his points value. He becomes, and with this initial release of characters and the points values and where they're at, there are a fair few that are sort of at 15 or 16 for elites, and it's just a little more difficult to try and get sort of that third, to have a 3-person team when all the others are on the 8s. The 7 points value just allows you to slot in a few more, but of course that's going to change as the game has progressed, and if you're maybe watching this in the future. So it feels like this is a character who is slotting into quite a lot of decks. He cheaply opens up red cards to you. which at the moment I don't think is super valuable for the splash. I think people are much more likely to splash yellow and blue at the moment because of the control that they bring to the game. But there may be a particular strategy or tactic even that you've identified that you think, well, this would be good to be building in my deck, and I need some red cards for that, and maybe the First Order Stormtrooper will be able to open that up for you. But generally, the kind of decks that we're seeing him in, there's quite a few ones that are making a good use of these non-uniques, so those single die characters. So we've seen characters, we've seen decks, which is really quite a good one, I think, where you have 3 First Order Stormtroopers plus a Nightsister. Now I quite like that list because you've got all ranged damage there, and the Nightsisters are 1 and 2, so they got a 1 in 3 chance of bringing some damage to the table as well. But of course, the Nightsister helps the whole bunch of Stormtroopers just to have access to a bit more control. Blue's good for control, and especially for damage mitigation, and that's going to mean that essentially when you're choosing a 4-person team, a 4-character team, you've got a lot of extra hit points. So if you can include some blue, which is going to bring more control and especially I would say damage mitigation, wow, the effective hit points that you've just pushed your overall team up to is really huge. It's basically at 28, plus any sort of things like force chokes and force throws and things like that are just going to be able to stop damage coming at you. It really does effectively feel like you're pushing that number up to 30 plus in terms of effective hit points. So I think that's quite a good strong list. Another one that's also looking really quite good is 3 First Order Stormtroopers plus Politique. Now Politique's, I've done a tactical on him, I've done a tactical on Nightsister as well, but Politique's good. He brings focus himself, which is definitely one of the things that helps with Stormtroopers. Remember, with your Stormtroopers, you're looking at 2 blank sides, so any focus on the table with your First Order Stormtroopers is really good because of the likelihood of them managing to not hit one of their, every time you roll a die, at 50% chance you're not going to get what you want, so if you want them for damage. So focus is really helpful with Stormtroopers. The only thing with yellow is there's probably not masses amount more that comes out of yellow that you'd actually want going with these. So things like jetpack, great, but there's not a lot else. Everything else becomes, well, they're good solid yellow cards, but they're not really bringing anything specific to a deck running Stormtroopers in terms of helping the Stormtroopers or improving the Stormtroopers or making them massively more effective. So that's something to be and of course if you bring things like infantry grenades and thermal detonators, be very careful, because if your opponent's playing cunning, well then they're sort of you're opening the potential of them using up your sort of area control, as it were, or multiple character damage against you, and that's really not cool. So, but Politique is strong because, of course, of his finishing ability, and alongside the Stormtroopers, where you can chuck out really quite a bit of damage in one turn. Because of course with these you want to be chucking blasters on them, you want to be chucking maybe promotions on them, but certainly blasters of any variety, F11D, the DH 1 cost 1, the holdout blasters, all those are good on these, and they're going to really ramp up the damage that you can be putting out. And a deck like that can really put out a lot of hurt. If you get a decent roll, I mean, you're looking at 8, 9, 10, well, I mean, looking at 8 damage just out of the character dice if you've got 3 Stormtroopers and Politique potentially. So plus upgrades, it can go really silly. Lots of damage potential. And of course, you could also do 2 First Order Stormtroopers plus Politique and a Nightsister. And I think that becomes really interesting. You've got to be careful with your card choices, because you don't want too many spotter. Rainbow, I still think, is a little dangerous at the moment because of the amount of cards that are good but do say spot on them. And so if you're building around that, I'd just be a little more careful with which ones you include, because if I was playing against a deck like that, I'd be getting rid of Politique pretty quickly, and then the Nightsister. So those are things to consider. So when it comes to some other tips for actually playing First Order Stormtrooper, well, if you're playing him in a deck like the one we just talked about, then you're going to want a card like Squad Tactics. Squad Tactics allows all of your non-uniques to activate all at once, and that can bring a super amount of pressure, of course. And that's really what we're wanting to generate with a deck like that. We're wanting to stress our opponent out with trying to deal with loads of damage coming all at once, big alpha damage, big alpha strikes. So Squad Tactics really piles the pressure on. Of course, it makes you vulnerable to cards like Dodge and so on, which Dodge is a card I think that at the moment seems to be quite a good include in the meta. I never thought I'd be saying that when I first looked at the card, but there you go. Even for 2 resources, it seems to be worth quite a bit. Another card that you could use, or another way of using your Stormtroopers, is if you've got a deck where you've got 3 or 4 characters. Drudge Work really isn't terrible. There aren't many ways in the game currently of really ramping up resources, and I think that, so at the moment, I think Drudge Work isn't a bad way to get yourself those resources. I think it depends obviously how you're using it, but if you're playing a control deck, you really don't really mind early on losing the damage that the First Order Stormtrooper brings. You don't mind not having the 1 and the 2 and the 2. Essentially, you're trading that dice for extra resources. So that can be quite useful. That can be pretty good to accelerate you. And then mid to late game, once you've established control and got lots of upgrades out, and you've accelerated through that early phase, well, then you can start resolving that trooper, hopefully for some damage. Then overwrite the upgrade, change things up. So I think that works really quite well. And of course, another big one to bear in mind, that's a great play if you've got Stormtrooper in your deck, is Endless Ranks. I talked about how the sort of effective hit points pool of your deck is sort of magnified when you have more characters. Because if you've got one of the decks I mentioned earlier on, you're looking at 28 or even 29 health base. So if you can then ever at some point get the Endless Ranks off, now at 5 resources that's a lot, but I feel like it makes the include of a Stormtrooper, it makes it pretty crazy, because you've just got another Stormtrooper back, which is going to absolutely sway things mid to late game. If they've invested all these resources to get rid of a character, it goes without saying, I know, but I'm going to say it anyhow, because I think it's an important thing to take into account when you're evaluating the value of a Stormtrooper in your deck. Can I Endless Ranks him? Am I playing a deck that's going to have 5 resources potentially available, or am I trying to razz out so many upgrades that it's unlikely? But I would say that for most decks, by the time you get to the end of the, you get to that end game and you're really grinding it out, unless you've got lots of events in your deck and you're able to play lots of those, often you start finding upgrades are piling up in your hand. You're down to that last character and he's got 3 upgrades, and your resources can start to build up. That's your classic time for an Endless Ranks to come in. So I think it is a strong card. I think it is a good card. And if you take your hit points of your team from 28 and then boost it up to 35, that's so many hit points for any deck to try and get through. that can really make the difference. Another one I haven't mentioned as well, which is another deck I should say, is Django and 2 Stormtroopers, 16 and 14 points. Does feel quite nice, that one. Django's fast, and he's bringing a lot of damage to the table. That is one of those decks that will live and die by its rolls. A lot of other decks, they have a bit more inbuilt resistance to bad rolling. You've just got more ways of manipulating dice, whereas when you've got Django and 2 Stormtroopers, it's hard. You're kind of relying upon those Stormtroopers to get some damage out, to support Django effectively, and that's harder. That's harder, especially with Django. If it's Jabba, well then you've got focus available, which yellow's pretty good for, but don't really have much of that with Django. So, but it's a really interesting build, and it really can alpha you out of the game, and kill characters on turn 2 and potentially even turn 1 if it really goes off. So, one other thing I think that's a good include just to mention: if you are running some blue, Power of the Dark Side actually becomes a lot better, because rather than just a 1 in 6 chance of its ability going off, well obviously now it's a 1 in 3 chance of the ability going off, because 2 of those sides are blanks with a Stormtrooper die. And as often with that Stormtrooper, you're trying to re-roll for some damage. That Power of the Dark Side works super well, because if you're trying to re-roll for damage, well actually using a Power of the Dark Side, you have got a 5 in 6 chance of doing damage and a 4 in 6 chance of being able to do 2 damage with that die when you re-roll it with Power of the Dark Side. Those are really great numbers. Those are super amazing numbers when you've got a character and it costs 7 points. So if you've got some blue, I'd strongly have to consider getting 2 Power of the Dark Side supports in there, because it can really increase the just the damage output of your Stormtroopers. Anyway, please put comments, anything extra that you think of, hints, tips, ways of playing Stormtroopers, good decks that you've seen them in, whatever. Add it onto the comments, because of course we want newer players coming to these videos to be able to glean lots of information from them, and help them to start enjoying Destiny as much as you and I do. So thanks so much. I've had loads of comments and loads of support on the videos recently. Loving that. And if you want to get in touch with me, I am Peace Lord, and you can get in touch with me on the Knights of Ren Discord channel. Would be one of the easy ways. Of course, you can always leave me a comment on here as well. Thanks so much. So until next time, keep playing Destiny.